Off to Joe Felter.
Thanks very much, Steve. What is really an extreme privilege to welcome General Jim Mattis to class this evening. I know he insists on very brief introductions, so I'll follow orders. But General Mattis is the Davies Family Distinguished Fellow here at the Hoover Institution. And his public service career spans over half a century. He joined the Marine Corps back in 1969, and he served with distinction at every level of the Marines, from platoon commander to lieutenant, all the way through a 4-star general as a combatant commander of U.S. Central Command. Most recently, he led our entire U.S. Defense Department as the nation's 26th Secretary of Defense. He's a consummate warrior scholar, well known for his huge personal library, author of the New York Times bestseller, Call Sign Chaos, Learning to Lead. As many of you might imagine, he has many demands on his time, especially now. And I think being here with our students in class today, it really underscores his commitment to teaching, coaching, and mentoring our young generation. There's really no greater friend of America and our allies and partners everywhere. General Mattis, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, well, thank you, Joe. Thanks, everybody. I was having a great time. I'm taking a lot of notes from you bright young people. You're working on some good stuff. I'd rather just sit here and listen, but go ahead, please, Joe.
There's more to come, General. General, I think you're in Washington State right now in the same town that you grew up in. We know that when you were younger, you wanted to teach history, physics, and maybe coach football in your hometown there in Eastern Washington. But you took a different path, fortunately for so many of us. What inspired you to choose a career of public service in the Marine Corps?
Well, like all of us, we have plans at least when we're young, and we think that's where we're going to go. I came of age. I graduated, like you said, in 1968, and it was during a war. And in those days, the draft was on, so all the young boys had to sign up for the draft when they turned 18. And it was very clear that in light of my dubious record in college, plus the way the war was going, I was going to get drafted. So where I'm from, a bunch of us young guys went down and joined the Marines, figuring, well, we'll go in and do our 3 years, and then we'll get back and we'll get back to living again back in our hometown, coaching football and skiing in the winter. So I had my whole life planned out, and well, it's time to go. It was kind of like our patriotic chore. So I intended to go in and just do my couple of years and move on.
Well, speaking of patriotic chores, General, after this incredible career of service in the Marine Corps, you volunteered again when called to serve as our 26th Secretary of Defense. I was here at Stanford when you got that call, and boy, we sure loved having you here, seeing you in jeans, having the occasional beer with the military veterans at Stanford. But was accepting the President-elect's invitation to serve as Secretary of Defense, was it a difficult decision?
Well, we're all the product of how we're brought up. And I've been brought up by what we call the greatest generation. And they're called that because they came out of a worldwide depression. They defeated fascism. They went to the people of Germany and Japan and Italy after the war and welcomed them back into the community of nations. They didn't act, at least all except the Soviet Union, we did not act like a conquering army when we defeated fascism. And they brought us up to believe that government service was noble. It was a privilege. When you're asked to serve, as long as you're prepared, you say yes. You don't get into, Hamlet up on the castle walls, wringing his hands saying, should I or shouldn't I? As long as you're prepared, President asked, Republican or Democrat, male, female, doesn't matter. If you're asked to serve, then you go. So I went back to get the interview, and I'd never met Mr. Trump, never spoken to him, and went into a room with him and his vice president-elect and chief of staff, and promptly disagreed with him on the 3 things he asked me about. And I thought, well, there we go, back to Stanford, hooray. But things happened. He decided he wanted me, and he did change his position on a couple of things we'd talked about. So no, it was not a difficult decision. I didn't aspire to the job. I'd been the personal or the military assistant for both the Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Defense in the Clinton administration. And I knew what the job was all about. I knew what it was like to have to be woken up repeatedly in the middle of the night. I knew what it was like to be handed the card that you have to carry in your wallet. That is how you confirm who you are in the event we have to unleash the nuclear effort. a very sobering thing. So it was not a job I wanted to go to, but when asked, it was a job that I felt was my duty to do. And so I was on my way, departing from Stanford and going back to Washington, D.C.
We're very fortunate that you chose to serve, General. General, in some of your recent writings, you quoted James Madison, warning from the Federalist 41. And his quoted that you said, "America united with a handful of troops or without a single soldier exhibits a more forbidding posture to foreign ambition than America disunited with 100,000 veterans ready for combat." Is Madison's assessment, is it still accurate and relevant today? And what can the young generation do to help bring about greater unity in our country?
It's interesting times because I'm concerned that those are the people with my color hair have not given an example to you of how democracies work. How we go into elections. Elections are all about divide. That's what they're about. Vote for me. I know a better way to do it than that guy. Or vote for her. She's smarter than that one. And you divide people. And I understand that. And sometimes it's not real civil. Well, welcome to democracy. But when the elections are over, it used to be that people rolled up their sleeves, they compromised, collaborated. Sometimes they still had arguments, but they still went to church together. They still went to dinner together. Their wives still got together. Their husbands still got together. It was a time when we actually used governing to solve problems. And I don't know that we're doing that so well anymore. We're not doing it well right now. I'd go so far as to say, because we're staying in a perpetual divide and electioneering kind of role. And governing takes unity. Governing takes collaboration, conversation. Governing means that you don't say something about somebody else's position until you know it at least as well as they know it. And you can argue their position at least as well as they can. And I think that right now, if we don't get back to that sort of unity in the country, there's nothing wrong with having good arguments, but a government that was put together, my fine young folks, with 3 co-equal branches of government and a bicameral legislature. It is impossible to govern this country unless we are willing to cooperate and compromise. It cannot be done. And so we're going to have to get back to that. And we need some of you young people with fresh ideas and a willingness to listen to people you disagree with and listen to them with respect, and then dive deep into where's the common ground, and let's pull together on the governing side. Then we can have a whale of a good election again, yell at each other and all that kind of stuff. And then boom, when it's over, we go back together, we work again together. If we don't do that, this sort of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, it simply cannot work. And so you've got to keep working at it. I love seeing you folks working on these kind of issues about how do we defend this country, because we need to defend it. It is not something that's written in concrete, carved into granite or something that says we will always exist, this form of government. It's actually not existed very much in the history of the world. So it's good to see that you all are looking at how can you help keep it alive, because it needs defense.
Thank you, General. General Mattis, in the lean startup methodology that our course co-author Steve Blank helped develop, the term pivot, it refers to a course correction. It's based on feedback from the marketplace. Now, Secretary of Defense, and I recall this, you pivoted the entire Department of Defense with the new National Defense Strategy. I mean, how did you determine this pivot was necessary, and what did it look like? Or what should it look like, I should say?
Yeah. Well, what happened, I was watching as these presentations were going here with how you quantified problems, you quantified the weight of batteries, or you quantified the number of things that had to be powered. And then you were looking at how do you actually bring in qualitative judgment as well. So going into the job, ladies and gentlemen, under our system of government, you have to go up and get the advice and consent of the Senate. And that's not just some members of the Senate. You actually go up for a hearing. And so for 30 days, I flew back east, and for 30 days, you go up and you call on senators and congressmen in my case, because I needed a waiver from the House of Representatives. I hadn't been out of the military long enough to qualify for the job under the law. And I was going up talking to them, And I kept asking the people who were informing me, I need this strategy. I need to see what strategy so I know what to say to these senators. Well, fortunately, they never asked me about it because I never got the strategy. And so the first day at the Pentagon, it's a Saturday at noon, I walk in and there are just 4 of us at a table. The holdover from the Obama administration, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, a great public servant named Bob Work, and then the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the Vice Chairman. And the 4 of us are sitting there. And I started off by saying, you know, gentlemen, for the last 30 days, I asked for your strategy and I never got it. And I could not order you to do it because I didn't have the advice and consent of the Senate. I said, now I need it. I've got 2 letters to next of kin who died. I need to know what we're fighting for. And the chairman looked me right in the eye and he said, we don't have one. And we haven't had one in 10 years. In other words, it's not just one political party. It's not a political statement. Now, you're going to hit moments in your lives, my fine young people, when you're just going to feel like you got socked right in the stomach. But that's what it felt like right then. So I said, okay, we're going to write one. We're going to write it real fast. And so we started working on it. I went home that night, threw my bags in the corner of the bedroom of the house I rented, and got out my legal pad and I started writing. And I took what I was writing, and brought in some real bright young folks. And we went up and talked to congressmen, both parties, talked to think tanks, went all over NATO, talked to every country that wanted to talk to us, went to Tokyo and Seoul, putting this strategy together. And it had to start the same way you all started, with a problem quantified. We'd been through 4 administrations, for example, that pretty much focused on terrorism. That's what I've been doing there in my last years in the military. But it was very, very clear that those 4 administrations had a view of China coming on board and becoming a responsible stakeholder in the international community that has not proven to work out. I think it was the right thing to do by every one of those Democrat and Republican administrations. They had to try. But it was very clear with what was going on with China, the intellectual property theft, the seizing of features in the South China Sea, I can go on, the piling massive debt on others, it was not working. And so we had to look at what was the big threats to America in the future. And you didn't look at what people intended to do, you looked at what they were capable of doing. And I basically said, terrorism is going to be here. We're going to have to deal with it. It's simply going to be an ambient threat, going to be with us. But they can't change our way of life if they don't get their hand on a weapon of mass destruction. So we'll focus on that. And then in terms of urgency, the Obama administration did a very good job of turning their concerns over to us about the North Koreans. And they were quite right, warning us about it. And we moved quickly to try to force that effort off the military page and into the foreign ministers, the diplomats' lap. In terms of just plain raw power, it was Russia that was threatening to turn America into radioactive ash, had invaded Georgia and seized part of Ukraine as well. And in terms of will, we were going to have to address China. And so I flew, I met my counterpart from Beijing in Singapore and started working with him. Went to Beijing and invited him to Washington, D.C. We were trying to put all these things together into a strategy. And all a strategy is the ends and the ways and the means. And here we needed State Department to get out in front on the ends because we'd militarized our foreign policy over the preceding 20 years. And I needed to move the military into the backseat on foreign policy, supporting diplomats and buying time and credibility for diplomats, but then be ready with a deterrent force with nuclear weapons, a compelling force with conventional military, and able to fight irregular warfare. And that was the problem statement, and that was what we came up with. Why did I do it, ladies and gentlemen? Because this is the only way we're going to turn this responsibility for keeping a country safe over to the next generation is by defending it, and that means with as many allies as we can get. And so our main line of effort was, how do we maintain a safe and credible nuclear deterrent so those weapons